Chapter 9, Organizing Your Speech. Before we get into Chapter 9, just a couple quick reminders here for you. First, make sure you're taking notes, as this will become your study guide for both the comprehensive final at the end of the semester and for the chapter test. Also, ensure that you are reading the chapter. After reading the chapter, you should be able to define the key terms, and you should be able to answer the questions at the end. So with that said, Chapter 9, Organizing Your Speech. In order to maximize the message that we're trying to get across as the speaker to our audience, we need to have some sort of strategic organization with our information. And when we think about strategic organization, we're thinking about organizing the speech to achieve a particular result with a particular audience. So when we talk about an informative speech, we're giving information, we need some sort of way to organize that information that both makes sense and supports our topic. In addition, if we're doing a persuasive speech, we also need to make sure that we have some sort of problem solution, as we're going to be presenting a problem and then asking our audience to adopt a solution. So within our body of our speech, we're going to have main points. The main points are going to differ depending on the structure, but within the main points, that's where we're going to develop the information we have. And then most speeches are going to be somewhere between 2 and 5 main points. So we're going to go and take a look at a couple different organizational patterns that we can use to help strategically organize our speech. So up first is going to be that of chronological order. Chronological order allows us to have the main points that follow a particular pattern. So an example of a chronological speech might look like, with the topic of the Great Wall of China, main point 1, building the Great Wall begun during the Qin Dynasty of 2021 through 206 BC. Main point 2, new sections of the Great Wall were added during the Han Dynasty of 206 BC to 220 AD. And main point 3, the Great Wall was completed during the Ming Dynasty of 1368 through 1644. So we see how this follows a pattern of time. So it's chronological in order of the creation of the Great Wall. Another type of organizational pattern that we can utilize is going to be that of the spatial order. And this allows for the main points to follow some sort of directional pattern. So if we take the topic of a hurricane, we might see our main points being at the center of the hurricane is the calm, cloud-free eye. Surrounding the eye wall. Surrounding the eye is the eye wall, a dense ring of clouds that produce the most intense wind and rainfall, and rotating around the eye wall are the large bands of clouds and precipitation called spiral rain band. So let's take a look at an example of kind of how that would all sound using our spatial order.
Now that we've looked at the relatively calm eye of the hurricane, let's take a look at the next ring of the storm. Surrounding the eye of the hurricane is the eye wall, a dense ring of clouds that produce the most wind and rainfall. It's very hard to see the eye wall from above, but you can see it more clearly in this graphic. The eye is the lighter colored area in the middle, and the eye wall is the darker area on the sides. Winds in the eye wall exceed 155 miles per hour, which is why this part of the storm can cause so much destruction.
Our next type of organizational pattern is the causal order. We might use this more in the persuasive series, as we would use the chronological and the spatial order for our informative speech. But the causal order simply shows how the main points show a cause and effect relationship. So let's take a look at an example of what that might look like. So if we take the topic of air traffic controllers, we might have main point one being the U.S. aviation system faces a growing shortage of qualified air traffic controllers. And main point two, if the shortage continues, it will create serious problems for airline safety. So the next type of organizational pattern, once again, a great one for the persuasive series, that is going to be the problem solution order. This is what we're going to use for our first persuasive speech, wherein the first main point is the problem and the second main point is the solution. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So if we take the idea of a puppy mill, we might have main point one of puppy mills are a serious problem across the United States. And then main point two, solving the problem requires legislation and individual initiative. So let's take a look at how that might be presented.
In addition to suffering from physical problems, dogs in puppy mills are often emotionally unstable. Some are dangerously violent and aggressive. Others are apathetic and lack any desire to interact with people or animals. Because of the overcrowding in puppy mills, some animals literally go crazy and chew off the ears, legs, and tails of other dogs. But you can see for yourself what the dogs have to endure. Here's a picture of a puppy mill provided by the U.S. Humane Society. As you can see, the cages are stacked one on top of another, and the dogs are packed into the cages like sardines into a can. The dogs are not let out to go to the bathroom, so the cages are filled with waste and become breeding grounds for the diseases I mentioned earlier in my speech. You can get a better sense of how disgusting a puppy mill is from this photo, taken after the dogs were removed by animal officials. You can see how narrow the cages are and how they're crammed one against the other. You can see that there's filth and debris everywhere.
Another organizational pattern that we're going to take a look at is topical order, where the main points are divided in the main points divide the topic in a logical, consistent subtopic. Once again, this would be another great example of organizational patterns for our organizing our informative speech. So if we take the topic of Josephine Baker, our outline might look like main point one, as an entertainer, Josephine Baker captivated audiences in Europe and America. 2, as a spy, Baker gathered information on Nazi activities in France during World War II. And 3, as a civil rights activist, Baker worked for racial equality on a variety of fronts. So when we're thinking about main points, whether it's in any of the previously mentioned organizational patterns, we want to make sure that we keep the main points separated. We want to try to have the same pattern of wording, and we want to balance the time devoted to each. If you start to have lots of main points, so if you have more than 3 main points, you probably need to consider looking at some of those main points and consolidating them together. So in order to add some more depth and breadth to our topic within our main points, we're going to add supporting materials. And supporting materials are just simply materials used to support your ideas. So they're there to reinforce and support what you are saying. So kind of bringing everything together is the idea of connective. And these are kind of our transitions between main points and thought throughout the presentation. So we're going to take a look at different types of connectives here in just a second. But those connectives are just simply the words or phrases that are connecting your ideas and points together. So we're going to take a look at transition, internal preview, internal summary, and signpost. So we'll go ahead and define each one of these for you, and then we'll take a look at some examples where they're applied within a portion of the speech. So up first is going to be that transition. And transition just simply indicates the speaker has finished with one thought, is moving on to another. So we utilize the transitions primarily between our introduction and first main point and second main point third, and third main point in the conclusion. Obviously, if you had less, if you only had two main points, you would still maintain that transition between intro, 1, 2, and conclusion. Let's take a look at an example in practice for transition. I have spoken so far as Cesar Chavez, the community organizer, but it was his work as a labor leader that truly etched his name in American history. So an internal preview, our second of those connectives, is a statement in the body indicating what the speaker will discuss next. So these can happen either in between our main points, or they can happen multiple times within a main point. Kind of identify your subpoint. So an example of an internal preview might sound like, in discussing how Asian Americans have been stereotyped in the mass media, we'll look first at the origins of the problem, and secondly at its continuing impact today. The next connective we're going to go ahead and talk about is the internal summary. And this is just a statement in the body summarizing the preceding point or point. So this can be used after main points, or this can be used within main points to kind of summarize the subpoint. So let's take a look at an example of what that might sound and look like. In short, palm reading is an ancient art developed in China more than 5,000 years ago. It was practiced in classical Greece and Rome, flourished during the Middle Ages, survived in the Industrial Revolution, and remains popular today in many parts of the world. Our final type of connective that we're going to talk about today is signpost. And signposts are just simply brief statements showing where the speaker is or focusing attention on key ideas. So let's take a look at a signpost example here. So an example might sound and look like, the first cause of the problem is insufficient agricultural production. The second cause is recurrent drought in the affected countries. And the final cause is mismanagement of available food resources by local leaders. So as we kind of wrap up here with Chapter 9 and organizing the speech, some things to consider as we went through. Hopefully you took some notes, as these will become your study guide for the test and then the comprehensive final at the end of the semester. You should have or be reading the chapter, and upon completion of the reading of the chapter, you should be able to define and apply the key terms and answer the questions at the end of the chapter.